even when we're not using slides. So in any case, I'll just share a few reflections. I have the very strong conviction based on a what I would consider to be a wealth of scientific fact that resilience indeed can be learned. I would say there's absolutely no question about that. And the way we think about resilience from a scientific perspective is that it is fundamentally associated with the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. The rapidity with which you recover from adversity. Individuals who recover quickly are more resilient. And we can measure that objectively in different systems of the brain, the mind, and the body. It tends to be the case that they all cohere. Not perfectly, but there is certainly broad coherence across these different response systems. What does that mean? Well, that means that a person's stress hormones, for example, will recover quickly if their brain circuits associated with threat responsivity also recover quickly. They're on different time courses, but they are highly correlated. And we and other scientists have demonstrated that. Um, I should have begun by saying that I am a neuroscientist by training. And in this stage of my career, I have become what I liken to climate scientists, and that is an activist scientist. It doesn't, I think, at all diminish my commitment to rigorous science, but it is because of the very fact that resilience is a skill, or more generally, that well being is a skill, that I believe we all have a collective moral obligation to act, because this actually can be cultivated. And not acting is really a moral failing. And so I think that we need to marshal all of the collective institutions of which we are a part to make this a possibility. We have developed a framework for understanding what we call the plasticity of well-being. This framework holds that there are four key pillars of well-being, and it turns out that every one of these pillars contributes to resilience. Resilience is not the privileged purview of just one. So, what are these four pillars of well-being? The first we call awareness. Awareness includes our capacity to regulate our attention. It includes mindfulness. It includes also a quality that psychologists and neuroscientists call meta awareness, which is knowing what our minds are actually doing. That may seem a little bit strange, but many people, I think, including myself, I'm sure many of you have had the experience of reading a book, for example, where you read each word on a page, and after one or two pages, you realize you have no idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. Well, that is a lapse of meta awareness. And the moment we recognize it, the moment we wake up, so to speak, that is a moment of meta awareness. Turns out meta awareness is really important for resilience. It could be trained. There's very good evidence to suggest that. The second component of well-being, or the plasticity of well-being, is connection. Connection concerns the qualities that are important for our social relationships, qualities like appreciation and gratitude and empathy and kindness and compassion. All of those too contribute um, to resilience. The third pillar of well-being we call insight. We all carry around a narrative about ourselves, about who we are. And insight is about deeply understanding the nature of this narrative. Some people on one end of a continuum have a very negative self-narrative. They have negative self-beliefs. They have low self-esteem. And they hold those beliefs to be a veridical description of themselves. And of course, that we know is a prescription for depression. And what is an essential ingredient of well being is not so much changing the narrative, but it is changing our relationship to the narrative so that we see the narrative for what it is. The narrative is a bunch of thoughts. And it turns out that this dimension of well being is particularly important for resilience. And those individuals who have learned to change their relationship to this narrative are better able to recover from adversity. And finally, the fourth pillar of well being is purpose. And purpose here is about finding our true north in life. It's not so much about going and finding something different to do that's, quote, more purposeful, but how can we derive meaning and purpose in what we are already doing? And this too turns out to be a really important constituent of resilience. So each of these four pillars can be taught. We are involved in extensive research to investigate this. We have actually, as part of a nonprofit that I started associated with our university center, we've created an app that trains all four of these pillars that's freely available throughout the world. It's called the Healthy Minds Program. And I would encourage any of you who are interested to please explore it. And we have published a randomized controlled trial showing the effectiveness of 1 month of training, including on measures of resilience. And we have a recent study that we did during COVID that's just soon to come out. It's not yet published, but it is in press. And we in this study, we investigated about 660 public school teachers here in the United States during COVID. And they went through 1 month of this training and they practiced an average of 5.5 minutes a day. And those data directly come from the app itself. So it's not based on self-report, it's based on actual usage, which we can track. And even though it was only 5.5 minutes a day, it resulted in enormous, highly significant benefit in reducing distress, improving well-being, and improving resilience. And so I should also mention we've created a version of this app for first-year college students, where it's been translated into Spanish. We're using it both in the US and in a number of other countries, including Mexico. And we are now involved in creating a high school version of this as well. So let me stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, Richard. That was a optimistic start to the discussion. I was just wondering, and we'll come back to Q&A in the end, but I couldn't help think whether what you said might also apply to the kinds of beneficiaries we work with who are really poor, really vulnerable. And I wonder, when survival is the only thing on your mind, how much self-awareness or you mentioned gratitude or under sort of connection. How is it still possible? Is it still it, would it still apply to that category of people that we work with who really are
Yeah,
fighting
so
to survive?
yeah, thank you so much for asking that important question. I would say that the answer is a qualified yes. And the qualification is, I think that there are important ways in which the presentation of this kind of intervention would need to be adjusted and perhaps combined with other related interventions in a complementary way for certain groups. And I should say that we just finished, and this also is a new paper in press. We worked with a group of around 300 extremely significantly abused teenage girls in Colombia. These are teenage girls, all of whom had ACE scores above 5. So this is an extremely distressed, challenged population. All um, came from very low income families. And we did an intensive 1 week intervention with them in collaboration with colleagues in Colombia. And this is a paper that's currently in press in the journal Child Abuse and Neglect. And we show substantial gains. And in fact, the magnitude of gains in this population is larger than we see in middle-class populations in the US. And we think it's larger because these are individuals starting out from a much lower baseline. So I would suggest that the answer is certainly yes. But again, it needs to be tailored to the appropriate context.
Thank you, Richard. I'm sure people will be posting questions in the using the chat function. I want to invite Akash. Akash, I think you're connected, right? I see you can. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Yeah, we can see you. So Akash, over to you. You have done something quite interesting using technology to really make this support kind of more accessible to people. And so let me not actually say more about it. But why don't you share your initiative?
Sounds great. Sounds great. And I will actually share some slides. I have about 10 minutes as well, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion as well. And while I'm pulling up my slides, I'll just say that so much of what Richard just talks about really resonates with me and motivates a lot of this work. A, the idea that we can train resilience and well-being and that it's a skill, and B, that there's this moral responsibility that comes with some of the science. And I hope that as I talk about the technology-based intervention that my team and I have developed, that those principles are illustrated in this talk. So let's see if the slides are being shared. Are people seeing the slides?
Yeah,
I'm
we
seeing
can see
not.
something. Maybe you want to move to the. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. Let me just move that. All right. So hi, everyone. I am Akash. I am a third-year PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm going to be talking about the Common Elements Toolbox, which is a single-session intervention for resilience, mental health, and well-being. And what I'd like to first do is give a quick overview of a couple of questions I'll be covering. One is, what do we know about technology-based interventions so far? What is the Common Elements Toolbox, or COMET as we call it, and why did we develop it? And what results have we obtained so far in some of our initial tests of the intervention? So one of the things that I think is really important to consider in conversations about training resilience and training well-being is the treatment gap, the idea that most people in need of mental health services with depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders do not receive any form of formal care. And as Richard noted, right, resilience isn't even something that's only for people who have a mental disorder. There are also plenty of people who just would benefit and whose quality of life would improve by receiving some of the skills that intervention scientists and well-being scientists have studied and have put together. And so one way to potentially address the treatment gap or reduce the treatment gap and expand access to evidence-based interventions is using digital technologies. And there have been a bunch of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have shown that digital self-help interventions can be effective at treating common mental health problems, at improving well-being, so on and so forth. And one of the really key advantages of digital interventions is that they're much more scalable than other kinds of interventions. Around the world, many countries suffer from shortages in trained providers for mental health and well-being skills. And so if you can get things into the hands of people who have access to the internet or access to smartphones, there's so much potential benefit on the scalability side. But we know something about existing digital interventions that I think is really worth highlighting. My colleagues and I have done some studies looking at publicly available mental health and well-being apps. So if you go on the iPhone App Store or the Google Play Store, you'll notice that there are plenty of apps designed to reduce stress, improve well-being, teach skills. But one of the key takeaways that we've found, and we've published some of these findings recently in the American Journal of Psychiatry, we've found that there are a couple of apps that are very highly used. So Calm, Headspace, to some extent Youper and Wysa, which are two AI chatbot apps. But many apps don't get active use. The y-axis on this figure is the number of monthly active users that each app is estimated to have. And what you can notice is that a couple of the apps, particularly these apps that focus on meditation and mindfulness skills, have a lot of active users, over 5 million, maybe up to 9 million. And then some have, still a fair amount of reach, maybe reaching around 1 million users. But many apps, and these are apps that show up in the top of the search hits, really don't take off, and people don't end up sustainably using them. And this reflects other findings in the digital mental health and well-being literature about how engagement, and particularly sustained engagement, getting people to use things, once a week or a few times a week for several months, is really, really difficult, right? We're competing with so many other types of apps that are catchy and flashy and grabbing people's attention. And so this has caused people to wonder, how can we create digital interventions that are evidence-based, but also that get people engaged, or that somehow get around this challenge of engagement? And that's where I think single session interventions really fit in. So in single session interventions, you basically establish that you're only going to have this person's attention for this 30-minute period or this hour-long period. And interestingly enough, some single session interventions have demonstrated significant effects in previous research. There's this meta-analysis by Jessica Schleider and John Weiss, which is really interesting, where they look at a bunch of single session interventions for youth depression and anxiety, and a couple of other conditions. And they've also developed a growth mindset intervention that is really interesting and has effects on adolescents up until 9 months post-intervention. So my team and I were inspired by this line of research, and we were thinking, okay, if we were to develop our own single session intervention, what goals would we have, and how would we determine what skills to include? And so we thought of 3 goals. One is we wanted to make sure that it was evidence-based, and for that we used a common elements approach, in which we basically looked at existing interventions from clinical psychology and positive psychology and the science of behavior change, and we tried to figure out what are some techniques that are commonly taught across a bunch of these different kinds of interventions. We also wanted to make sure that the intervention we developed wasn't redundant with existing interventions. And that's where some of the review papers on mental health apps came in handy, because we saw, for instance, that mindfulness and relaxation skills are very commonly taught, whereas other elements, for instance, elements from cognitive behavioral therapy that have been shown to improve resilience, are very rarely taught in existing interventions. And finally, we wanted to make sure that this intervention was culturally and contextually appropriate. I'm very interested in resilience and mental health interventions in low and middle income countries. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a framework in place where we would make sure that the intervention or interventions were appropriate for target populations. And we've done quite a few interviews and focus groups to try to adapt intervention content for various settings. For people who are curious to hear more about that aspect, there's a paper we have in the Asian Journal of Psychiatry in which we describe a 5-step approach for adapting single session interventions for adolescents in India. I won't go into it too much though, because I don't want to take up a million years of time. But this process led to the development of the Common Elements Toolbox, or COMET. And Comet has 4 main skills, 4 modules and 4 skills that we think can help promote resilience and mental health. One is cognitive restructuring, so teaching people how to notice thoughts that might not be serving them well or that might not be realistic, and how to reframe those. Another is behavioral activation, so getting people to reflect on activities that they do that can bolster mood, that can make them feel a sense of mastery, and having them schedule in those activities more often. Gratitude, so one of the core skills from a lot of positive psychology interventions, getting people to notice and appreciate some of the things that they're grateful for and some of the good things in their lives. And self-compassion, so extending the kindness and compassion in face of challenge or in face of suffering that people often show to others, but instead also showing, that same sense of compassion to oneself. And we have some art. We actually renamed cognitive restructuring and behavioral activation to flexible thinking and positive activities based on some of the interviews and feedback that we got. Some of these terms were more approachable, seemed more friendly to some of our adolescent audiences than cognitive restructuring and behavioral activation, which seemed a bit more technical or clinical. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about some of the results we found. So we've been mostly testing Comet in the context of high school students, college students, and graduate students, so school-based samples. And we did a study actually that lasted only 1 week with graduate students at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. In around March of 2020, students at the University of Pennsylvania and many other universities in the US were basically told to leave university or stay home. And that, resulted in a lot of stress and challenges. And so in late March of 2020, we basically released a version of Comet for graduate students. And we said, hey, there's no incentive here. You're not getting paid. You're not getting research credit. But if you want, there's this intervention we've been working on that might be able to help you adapt to this challenging time. And we were actually really impressed with the response we got. We had 209 grad students take this intervention in the week that we released it. And people rated the intervention as acceptable, helpful, engaging, and applicable to their lives. So we were quite pleased with this initial acceptability and feasibility data, but of course we wanted to have more confidence that this was actually working in the context of randomized control trials. So we've done 2 trials so far, one with college students in the United States, 291 participants recruited from March 2020 to May 2020. And we found that the intervention had a significant effect on depression that lasted to our final follow-up point, which was 12 weeks after the intervention. And we had a somewhat small effect on the full sample. And we did a sub-analysis where we looked at people who started off with higher scores on the depression measure that we used. And the effect size was actually stronger for the people who started off doing worse, which I think actually challenges some intuitions that sometimes I and others have had about single session interventions, which might be something like, oh, maybe they only work for people who are already doing pretty well, who are already not struggling too much. But we found, at least in this study, that those with elevated depressive symptoms may have benefited even more from this intervention than the universal sample. But we didn't find significant effects for anxiety and subjective well-being. And we have some reasons for why in the paper, but basically we think that some of the modules we chose have stronger evidence for effects on depression than effects on anxiety and subjective well-being. We also did a study with college students in India, about 500 participants, and they were recruited from August 2020 to April 2021. And we found significant effects at 1-month follow-up on the full sample and the elevated subsample. But we also found significant effects on anxiety. We're still analyzing the 12-week follow-up data, so it's still in preparation, but these initial findings we think are quite promising. Oh, and of course, 95% of participants rated Comet as acceptable and appropriate, which we were very pleased about, because there's always a concern of when you transport these resilience interventions into new settings, into new cultures, there's a risk that people might not actually think these are super relevant or super acceptable or super appropriate. And it from our data, doesn't seem like that was true for most of the participants. I'll just conclude by saying we have a lot of ongoing work. I think this single session intervention work has been very exciting, and I appreciate that others have been interested in it as well. We are doing some work in India with in collaboration with Ashoka University, some work in Kenya in collaboration with the Shamiri Institute, some work in Greece with the University of Athens, and some work in Kenya funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. And I'll acknowledge, like, there are so many wonderful people in my circle, including my advisor, Robert Derubis, my collaborators, Marty Seligman and Angela Duckworth, and a bunch of organizations like the National Science Foundation that fund and support this work. And I'll just mention, if anyone on this call is interested in learning more about COMET, if there's a population that you think it might be useful for, some of these collaborations have formed through people just reaching out to me and saying, hey, we think this thing could be adapted for college students in Mexico or cadets at an Air Force Academy as examples. So I'm really interested in people who are interested and excited about this work. And I will stop talking now because I've been rambling too much, and I'm curious to see if people have questions or any discussion comments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Akash. I have so many questions I want to ask you actually, but I want to not abuse my position as moderator here. And we'll come back, and hopefully we have some, so there's a question already about how long it takes for a COMET session, but maybe we'll come back to questions. Kate, over to you, describing your work in India and Rwanda and Kenya also, I believe. So over to you, Kate.
Great, thank you. And I'll just pull up some slides that I'll be sharing. As I do that, thank you so much, Akash and Richard, for the presentation so far. It's really exciting to hear about the work, all the really wonderful work that's going on. All right, I'm hopeful that you're able to see my screen. Yes? All right, good. Good. All right. Well, thank you so much again for all the amazing presentations so far. And thanks also, of course, to S4YE for including us in this set of presentations. I'm Kate. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Corestone, and I'm going to be speaking to you about Corestone's work on school-based resilience programs for youth in LMICs. So first, I'd just like to start out with a little bit of information about who we are. We like to say that we work at the nexus of resilience and social change, and we aim to help youth bounce back from challenges and thrive, improving themselves, but also their situations and circumstances. So we conduct evidence-based resilience programs in low and middle income countries, though we are based in Baltimore, and we do have subsidiary offices in India. We take a pretty specific approach in which we emphasize innovation, research, and advocacy. Any program that we design prioritizes scalability and is meant to be easy to adopt, adapt, and implement, prioritizing sustainability and cost effectiveness. We also emphasize research and evidence. Our programs are both evidence-based and evidence-generating so that we know that what we do is effective, feasible, and scalable. Finally, we're really encouraged to see that resilience is a field that's starting to gain traction in a number of international settings, exemplified, for instance, by this webinar. And we aim to contribute to and build this movement via partnerships, advocacy, and dissemination. We have 5 core resilience programs, and I'm going to mainly be talking about 2 of them today, but I'll at least mention all 5 for context. Youth First is a school-based resilience and adolescent health program for girls and boys. We currently conduct this in India and Rwanda and have also conducted it in Kenya. In India, we mainly conduct Youth First in Bihar, which is one of India's most disadvantaged states, where we're working directly with the government. We are currently conducting demonstration and technical transfers such that Youth First can eventually be scaled up across all 26,000 middle schools in the state, which would reach 2.6 million kids annually. Girls First is a similar program, but it's implemented through government-run hostels for marginalized girls. Currently, this is also in Bihar and is in process of scale-up, also in partnership with the government, to the approximately 530 KGBDs in the state eventually at scale. InReach is our first fully remote program, which aims to reach marginalized adolescents to support mental health during and after COVID-19. The SHG Resilience Project and the Resilient Parent Program, those are adult programs for self-help group members and parents of young children. So again, today, I'm mainly going to be speaking about the first two, Youth First and Girls First, because these are our school-based programs. So I'll highlight a few key points about how these school-based programs work. And again, this is Youth First and Girls First, as on the previous slide. First, we generally conduct programs via a cascading train-the-trainer model, in which we partner with governments and/or NGOs, and then we train master trainers who are on staff there. These master trainers in turn train teachers as facilitators, and sometimes there's an extra layer in between master trainers to teachers depending on context and availability of resources. In turn, these teachers conduct sessions for their students. Sessions are held for students in grades 7 and 8, and there are generally between 25 and 32 sessions depending on the location. These sessions are held weekly for 1 hour during school time, and this lasts for 1 or 2 school years, again, depending on the location. They're conducted as teacher-facilitated peer support groups of just about 15 students per group. So all of our programs, whether they're school-based or out of school, for adults or children or anything in between, follow what we call the Cornerstone model. So our tagline is that development starts inside, which we really are discovering through research to be true. And essentially that means that if you start with internal work, a lot of the development outcomes we're all working towards are going to become more possible. So we always begin our programs with self-discovery, and then we layer on top skills for intra and interpersonal growth. So this leads to both individual and social transformation in terms of well-being and social change. This is all underpinned by facilitated peer support, which enables social connection and collective action. Depending on the location, we frequently pair the resilience program with other program components, such as adolescent health and human rights components, in which kids can apply resilience skills to specific concerns in their lives. So what challenges youth apply the resilience skills to is that's one of the things that tends to vary by location. So the main components that tend to change across countries, cultures, and populations are the stories and the examples that we use, and at times what kind of program we pair the resilience curriculum with. So I just like to provide a quick example of how these components of the model work in practice in one example program. So we'll just take Youth First Rwanda. There are 25 sessions in this program, and that's split into 12 themes. This happens over the course of 1 school year. The first themes deal with self-discovery. Kids first work on building trust and listening skills, then go into a number of sessions understanding their strengths, what strengths they'd like to build and utilize more. We then get into what goals and the desires they have in their lives, whom and what they would like to become, and work on planning how to get there. We also talk about understanding emotions and how to manage these in a healthy way. We then move on to these skills for inter and interpersonal growth. So that starts with assertive communication and conflict resolution, then moves on to problem solving, identifying and opposing violence, and forgiveness and apologies. In Rwanda, the applications to social justice and health were of paramount importance for youth, so we then bring in topics such as changes in adolescence, positive relationships, gender and rights, and substance use and abuse, which encourage kids to apply their resilience skills to these specific challenges in their environment. Now, we don't have a ton of time, but I'd just like to highlight some of the results of our programs. So this is an RCT that was done regarding Girls First among 3,400 adolescent girls in 76 schools. The study had 3 intervention conditions and 1 control condition. So we were interested to see how the resilience curriculum, that's the self-discovery and skills for growth components on the previous slide, how that functioned both on its own and in combination with a more traditional adolescent health and empowerment program. So that adolescent health and empowerment program, that's the component that we were calling the application to health and social justice component in the last slide. This is the assessment framework that we used during that study, and it also reflects a number of different assessment frameworks that we used, a number of different studies following this one as well. So these tools that you can see on the right-hand side here are essentially previously validated tools that also underwent a piloting and validation process in this particular population, such that we felt confident that they would work in this population as well. So I won't read through each scale, of course, due to time limitations, but I believe the slides are going to be shared, so you can look in more detail later and can, of course, ask questions if you'd like. So these have been some of the tools that we found work well in this particular population in India. Some work well in other populations we've worked in too, but others do not. So I'll highlight just a few representative results from the study here that compare the combined resilience and adolescent health curriculum with the adolescent health curriculum alone. And all of the changes are significantly different between the two conditions. So by comparing the orange bars, that's the curriculum that combined both components, and the gray bars, that's the adolescent health curriculum only. You can see that adding resilience to adolescent health amplified the effects of the health curriculum. So this is true across not only resilience and psychosocial well-being indicators, these are the two bars of graphs on the left, but also across health indicators. So those are the graphs over here on the right. So this was also true despite kids not receiving any additional health content in the resilience curriculum. So this study suggests that our tagline may be right, at least the study suggests about health and social impact components as well, that development really does start inside, that if you add resilience and a focus on internal components into development, the development efforts that you're already doing, you may get better results, not just on your psychosocial outcomes, but on other outcomes too. Briefly, I'll also just mention that we've been in India since 2009, and we've followed a methodical process from innovation to scale up, which we're replicating in other countries as well. We started by looking mainly at feasibility and acceptability, then into efficacy and effectiveness, and then scalability, and finally transfer. And additionally, I will just highlight here that although the intervention was conceived as scalable from the outset, as all of ours are, there have been adjustments and evolutions based on partnerships and other pragmatic needs that have been made to the intervention as we went to make the program more scalable. Assessments, additionally, have evolved for scale. So the assessment framework that I showed you from the RCT, that's mainly appropriate, I'd say, for the middle section of this process during validation is our experience, where efficacy and effectiveness are your main interests. However, when you're moving into scalability and transfer, we've found that simpler assessments that capture whether the intervention's key messages are being delivered and tie the intervention to key areas of interest for stakeholders, those have become more important, at least in our experience. So thank you so much for your attention and for taking this whirlwind tour of Corestone and our school-based programs with me. I hope it helped to answer some of your questions that you have so far, and that also maybe you're starting to see some applications to your own work as well. And I'm looking forward to your questions during the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks also for sharing and for actually, measuring it so rigorously and sharing the results. I'm sure people will want to follow up with you. I want to now turn to Keiko. Keiko, you're connected, right?
Yes, can you hear me, Namita?
Yes, can hear you well.
Great. And can you see the slides?
I can see something that you're trying. Yeah, there you go. Yes.
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, good. That's great. So thank you so much for inviting me, Namita, and it's a pleasure to join this panel today. As Namita mentioned, I cover human development for Bangladesh and Bhutan. And so what I decided to do for today's session is to think about emotional intelligence development from the perspective of South Asia. So why does emotional intelligence matter in South Asian countries? I wanted to take this opportunity actually to mention that today we actually had a very good launch event for a report called Climate Afflictions in Bangladesh. And the report is actually a deep dive about the impact of climate change on infectious disease and also mental health. And it was no accident that it was launched today, which is World Health Day, which also Namita mentioned in the invitation for today's session. And one of the things that this report does that very nicely is to really look at dissecting who is actually vulnerable to mental health as a result of climate change in Bangladesh. So one of the things we found, for example, was that people who are living in big cities like Dhaka and Chattogram, they tend to have more depression and anxiety than people living elsewhere. And then we also were able to figure out that there are specific subpopulations, so women of ages 26 to 40 and the elderly who are more susceptible to depression. We also found through this report that there are these mood swings that are caused by weather and seasonality, right? So one of the things that we found was an increase in anxiety whenever we saw an increase in mean humidity and mean temperature. But it actually had an opposite effect on depression. So when we had increase in temperature, we actually saw a lower probability of depression. So some interesting findings that we were coming up with. And one of the things that's great about this report is that it's allowing us to start to think about how climate change impacts our mental health. It also allows us to really not only understand it on a national level, but it starts to answer questions like, geographically, where should we be targeting our interventions? Which subpopulation should we be targeting? And are there specific times of the year when interventions are going to be more impactful than others on alleviating mental health pressures? And the reason why I bring this up is because climate change is a huge risk in all of South Asia. We are estimating about 800 million people being at risk in our lower incomes as a result of climate change. 40 million people becoming climate refugees. We're hearing that, in fact, in Afghanistan, there are more climate refugees than there are as a result of the fragility and the crisis in the country. And in knowing that climate change impacts mental health so much, it is indeed what Richard said earlier, there's a bit of a moral imperative for us to make sure that we are taking these issues into consideration from the human development side. And yet we know to mental health that there's a lot of stigmatization. And this is something that was just recently shared by a colleague working on a very preliminary study in Nepal, where 30% of adults and adolescents agreed that seeking mental health treatment is a personal failure. And then 55% of adults, 49% of adolescents agreed that seeking mental health treatment is a sign of a weak will. So big hurdles to getting people to admit that they have maybe mental health issues. And what comes along with this study, which was a randomized experiment to really look at some interventions to try to encourage adolescents to go into counseling, was that there are some interventions that work to get parents to really think a little bit more about seeking help for their adolescents. But information treatments, such as explaining that mental health issues are common or treatable, or that seeking mental health support is not a sign of weakness, those kinds of interventions, unfortunately, did not increase the likelihood that the adolescents themselves will actually seek out counseling. So not only is there a bar to understanding that mental health is a challenge, there's a bar to then, even to those people who might understand that they have a mental health challenge, to then going out and getting the services that may actually be available to them. So and I think today's session I know focuses on youth. But I think one thing that I wanted to just take a step back and look at is our life cycle approach to skills development. And really looking at the study that was done by Cunningham et al. In 2014, part of that study looked at resilience specifically as a skill to develop. And one of the findings that they have is that there are optimal windows of opportunity to develop resilience as a skill. And perhaps contrary to what we might think, resilience, they found, is really best and most optimally developed in the very early years, from 0 to 5, and then from 6 to 11. That those are the best years for intervention if we really want to build resilience in people. And then in adolescence, that's a good time to reinforce some of those skills that are developed in the earlier years. And I think that this has important implications because increasingly what we're finding in the World Bank interventions is that our early childhood and childhood care and development programs have in fact been incorporating psychosocial stimulation, social emotional skills building programs. But those years from 6 to 11, where children, for example, would be in primary school, or the early adolescence years where they would be in perhaps secondary school, traditional education programs, although we're starting to treat children more as holistic development, I don't think that we see such a big emphasis there. In fact, from what I can see, we perhaps focus really on the early years, and then we go into youth development programs where we do see life skills development programs. And so we might be missing this middle, right? And this very important window of opportunity to really build up resilience. And therefore setting our youth up for more, better coping skills as they enter into those years. But I do want to end on a note of thinking through, though, how this research to action and financing can follow some of the science. So we do know, and I think I agree with the panelists, that indeed resilience is something that can be built, and it is something that we can build through training programs. So I thought I would just mention 2 programs that we have here in our region. So one is from the Maldives called the Enhancing Employability and Resilience of Youth Project. And I love this because it actually has the word resilience in there. Through their, it's basically a short course on entrepreneurship. They do include a model on emotional resilience building. And the purpose there is to build up the young people's confidence as they're pitching their business ideas through a business pitch competition grant. So it's very much practical oriented. And the other one that I wanted to mention is from Bangladesh, and I saw Shiro connected, and he's one of the TTLs for this project, but it's a recently approved project called the Accelerating and Strengthening Skills for Economic Transformation, where they've basically taken formal training programs and also enterprise-based training programs for youth, and then incorporated soft and life skills development. And I think what really sets this program, perhaps distinguishes it, is that it has a very strong focus on targeting, on women, on people with disabilities, on ethnic minorities, and other vulnerable groups, to ensure that these are the people that really benefit from these types of programs. So I'll just end there, just to note that from the World Bank side, I think what we're doing is incorporating these pilots that you're doing. And by the way, I am a University of Pennsylvania graduate, so it's great to see this pilot being done there, but also incorporating what's coming from academia, incorporating what's being done by other organizations, and then really trying to figure out how these fit with our client needs and how they fit with our investment operations. So thank you for this opportunity, Namita and colleagues, and I'll pass it back to you. Over.
Thanks, Keiko, and thanks for also highlighting the stigmatization issue. You may have the best tools, but if people just won't come to avail of it, then what are you to do? We have just a few minutes for question and answers, but I know, Richard, you need to leave quickly, but I would request you to address maybe one question that somebody asked in the chat function. When you talked about awareness, Richard, you and you know all of this work on mindfulness with John Kabat-Zinn, and of course all of the Eastern spiritual literature talks about awareness and mindfulness. You added another layer of complexity to it by saying meta awareness. Could you say a little bit more about that, and maybe how one might actually develop that muscle of meta awareness?
Sure. Meta awareness is the
in regular
monitoring
contact with them
function.
and all that kind of thing. But I just don't know what their space constraints are, or
Can I request everyone to
and it may
mute,
come down
please,
to like
so
a
we can
last
hear
minute thing where
somebody?
they say, "Oh yeah, of course, we'd like you to be there."
Okay.
You know, I have no idea.
Whoever's talking,
But-
please mute.
Thanks.
Okay. So meta awareness refers to the monitoring function of the mind and the brain. It is the faculty which enables us to know what is happening in our mind. A lot of the time there's activity going on in our mind of which we're not aware. And meta awareness is referring to this faculty of knowing what is going on in our mind, which is, we believe, a necessary condition for any other kind of transformation. So in order to learn resilience, meta awareness is actually required. And the way you train meta awareness is to, there are simple mindfulness practices that can train it. And there's very good empirical research to show that not only are behavioral measures of meta awareness improved, but there are systematic changes in the brain that support meta awareness that can occur with even modest amounts of training. And so one analogy which may help is we've all had the experience of being in a movie theater where we're so engrossed in the plot of the movie that we actually don't realize. We forget that we're in the theater. We may even not be cognizant of the fact that we're watching a movie. We're so engrossed. That would be an example of what we call experiential fusion, which is a kind of state where there is no meta awareness. But you can be just as attentive to the movie, and at the same time, you realize that you're actually seeing a movie. And, you know, that's actually the way the way our perception of reality actually works. The brain is constantly constructing the world, and we're the extent to which we know what it is our minds are doing, it gives us leverage to actually change it. If we don't have that meta awareness, there really is no possibility to change.
Yeah, so you're really saying that the ability to sometimes just distance yourself from the events and the thoughts and your own self sometimes that's happening in your life from just being able to observe it. You talked about fusion, so basically unfusing and looking at it as an observer, I guess.
Exactly. And this capacity of meta awareness is really something that is likely distinctly human. Pigeons have awareness, but they don't have meta awareness.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. It was a pleasure to have you. And I had more questions for Kate and Keiko and Akash, but I think we've run out of time. But maybe we can just follow up. I know that there are some really good questions. A lot of my colleagues are also thinking about the conflict affected situations that we work in and how relevant this kind of training it is, and then other questions about how do you design something just for youth versus something perhaps for adults. And I was also thinking, what about the workplace where young people transition to, and how this whole stigmatization affects even people in the world of work, where you want to look good to your colleagues, you want to look good to your boss, and so you would probably, as Keiko was saying, you think saying that there is a mental health challenge is just not an option because you're considered weak. It's a sign of failure. So and then what's the best timing to intervene? And I wonder if even your intervention, Kate and Akash, whether you took into account this whole thing about actually having people come forward. So even before they come forward, there is some work to be done about shifting people's mindsets. I'm sorry that we will have to probably continue at another session. I think this is the beginning of a dialogue. We really hoped that this would generate some more discussion amongst ourselves about how important this is, whether we talk about youth employment, or we talk about skills, or we talk about education, or we just talk about general, productivity of people at the workplace and our general sense of well-being in this world. This is an important topic, and I thank you all for joining. And I'm sorry that I mismanaged the time and we didn't get time for more discussion in the end. Thank you all. Thank you once again, Keiko, Akash, and Kate. I think Richard's already left. So thank you all.
Thank you so much for hosting. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.